All right, so let's get started. So welcome to the Songus Industrial History Center's online workshop series, Every Voice Counts, Teaching Civics Through Local History. My name is Kristen Gallus. I'm the project manager for education development at the Songus Industrial History Center, and I'll be your host and facilitator for tonight's webinar. The goal of this webinar series is to highlight how underrepresented communities in Lowell, in particular African Americans, women, immigrants, and youth, have fought for an equitable electoral process, and how by overcoming barriers to civic participation, they have persevered to secure their voice in the community. We hope to inspire educators to teach civics through local history and contemporary issues, connecting with the new Massachusetts social studies frameworks that focus on civics and civil rights. Funding for this series was provided by Mass Humanities, and we're proud to be part of Mass Humanities series, The Vote, which is an initiative of statewide conversations about civics. Real quick background on the Songus Industrial History Center. We're a partnership between the University of Massachusetts Lowell, College of Education, and the National Park Service. We're located in the historic Boot Mills of Lowell National Historical Park, and we're a hands-on center where students and teachers learn about the American Industrial Revolution through activities, tours of the sites where history and science happened. So in this time of remote learning, we are offering virtual field trips, which are an in-depth look at the topics related to the Industrial Revolution, all facilitated by professional educators. And I'll show you a quick slide that has some information about some of the virtual field trips that we're offering. And I want to say they're already doing their civic duty, because today we had a fourth grader tell us or ask us when we were talking about mill girl protests in the 19th century. And he was making connections to the current protests happening in our world today. And he was asking about violence and the connection between the violence and protest now, and were there violence and protest then, and he wanted to know how they worked 100 years ago, and did they work, this protests work the same way. So I felt like we did our civic duty in helping make those connections. We're also offering a series of remote learning modules, which are independent work assignments for students that contain primary sources, videos, and images on certain topics. A little bit about what's happening this evening. Our topic is becoming a citizen and the importance of voting, the immigrant experience. I know we all know how to use Zoom, but I'm going to quickly review Zoom tools. We're going to do who's in the room poll to see who's on with us this evening. We'll have our feature presentation, some Q&A. I'll share with you the primary documents and writing prompts that we've created on this topic, and any closing remarks. So as I mentioned earlier, this is recorded, which includes the chat. So do you mind what you put in the chat? We'll keep everybody on mute, but later when you have questions, we'll give you a chance to unmute, and you're welcome to be on video or not. We'd love to see you, because it's always better to talk to people's faces than a black void on the screen. So before we get to our presentation, I'm going to quickly launch some polls so we can figure out who's in the room. So if you could tell us what state or region you teach in. If you're not a teacher, that's fine. Just tell us where you work, just because we're curious about who's in the room. Right. So it looks like we are totally Massachusetts tonight. And then if you're a teacher, if you could tell us what grade you teach, that would be helpful. So we have middle school and high school represented tonight. And then our final question for teachers, what subjects do you teach? All right. It's a combination of history, social studies, and civics. Great. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. As the managing attorney for the International Institute of New England's growing Immigration Legal Services program, Chiara St. Pierre oversees a team of attorneys and Department of Justice accredited representatives who provide citizenship, family, humanitarian, and business immigration services. Under Chiara's direction, IINE's Legal Service Program provides immigration assistance to refugees, asylees, immigrants, including students, professionals, and entrepreneurs, and U.S. employers who hire foreign nationals. Chiara has worked as an immigration attorney for more than a decade. She specializes in both business and family immigration and has successfully represented a diverse portfolio of clientele, including Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, students, professionals, musicians, athletes, and families and individuals of all economic strata. She has experience with all family-based filings, citizenship and victim-centered filings, such as VAWA and U visas. Chiara also has expertise in employment-based non-immigration petitions, which is an alphabet soup of U.S. Immigration policy, which she'll talk about. She has experience interacting with government agencies involved with U.S. immigration, including the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. So I'm happy to welcome Chiara to be with us tonight. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go ahead, Chiara, it's all you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for attending tonight. Let me just get my screen set up so that you can see everything. Okay. So tonight's presentation is really a background of the citizenship process, what it takes from entering the United States as an immigrant, whether it be as a non-immigrant, as a visitor, moving to a lawful permanent resident status, which is also known as a green card holder, and then eventually citizenship. I'm not going to touch base on the history of voting rights. Those have been covered, I think, in prior webinars. I'm really going to experience and what that means and what that looks like. So we can dive right in. Our agenda for tonight, the first thing I want to go over are the overview of immigrant classifications, starting with non-immigrants. This other catch-all category, which includes refugees, asylees, TPS, which stands for temporary protected status, and parole. And then moving on to lawful permanent residents, which are also known as green card holders, and then citizen and citizenship. Resident process, and then the citizenship process. So the immigration classifications are non-immigrant, which are generally people here for a temporary period of time, lawful permanent residents, which is just as it sounds, permanent residents that are approved to be here and have the benefit of working in the United States, traveling, and with the idea that they're going to remain here permanently and make the United States their home. We also have kind of out of status are people that maybe overstay or cross the border illegally. That's inspection or IWI. And then we have this other category of asylees and refugees, temporary protected status, or individuals who have been paroled in. Parole happens most often in humanitarian situations. If there's a case to be made for extraordinary circumstances that somebody should be allowed to enter the United States under humanitarian parole. There's also a few other categories, but it's a temporary status that allows you to be here in the United States. So these are general ways that people enter the United States. The non-immigrant visa category, as Kristen mentioned earlier, is kind of an alphabet soup. There are all sorts of visas. I do have a slide about it, but but it ranges from B visas, which are tourists or visitors for business or pleasure, There's employment-based temporary visas. The H-1B is one that's in the news quite a bit and is probably the most common. There's an L-1 for intercompany transfers. So that's for, you know, organizations or entities that have offices abroad and in the United States and are doing business in both and maybe want to transfer executives or specialized knowledge individuals. There's also a treaty trader, treaty investor visa category for the E. That is for countries that we have a treaty of trade with, and then people that want to start a business of a treaty status, and then also entrepreneurs that maybe want to open a business and bring their business to the US. So all sorts of things, and it's, you know, there's a whole bunch of options to choose from under the non-immigrant visa program. Non-immigrants are allowed to be here for a specific period of time for a specific purpose. They don't have freedom like a green card holder has to work wherever they want to work. There's often restrictions. Sometimes it can be extended, sometimes it can't, depends on the visa category. And any violation of the terms of your non-immigrant visa status can result in a termination of that status, which would then mean that you are no longer allowed to be here. So let me see here. Moving forward, this is the example of the alphabet soup. I will not bore you by going through all of them, but you can see that there's visa categories for almost everything you can think of: religious workers, victims of a criminal offense, trafficking victims, organizations like NATO have a specific visa, crew members, tourists, work visas, fiance visas. So all sorts of things that fall under this non-immigrant visa category. There's also something called the Visa Waiver Program. This is for individuals who have a passport from certain countries that are allowed to enter the United States for 90 days without a visa. You must have the electronic system for travel authorization in order to qualify. But this is a great for people to come in and visit without having to get a visa first. Asylees and refugees are another common way of entering the US, and I want to distinguish between the two. Asylees and refugees are similar in the sense that they are granted status as a result of persecution and fear, okay? Asylees apply from within the United States. So they are here, they either came in on a different status or crossed the border, and they're applying for asylum. Whereas refugees go through the process overseas and are approved overseas, and all their background checks are done overseas, and then they're granted entry as a refugee. Both asylees and refugees are eligible to apply for lawful resident status after 1 year, assuming they meet all the other qualifications. And they're also eligible for benefits because these are considered humanitarian status. Temporary protected status is just as it sounds. It's a temporary status. The Secretary of Homeland Security can designate certain countries. To give you an example, El Salvador had been designated, Syria was designated. There's been a lot in the news about the current administration ending TPS, which did leave thousands of people without any protection here in the US. Many of those people have been here for years and maybe have US citizen children now. So it is a difficult thing to wrap your head around. And people who are here in temporary protected status often suffer from uncertainty. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if it's going to be extended, and they don't know what comes next. Also, temporary protected status generally does not provide a path to permanent residency. So you're kind of stuck in limbo, which is really difficult. And that's something that I think people are somewhat aware of, but don't always know the details of it. And you have to be in the United States in order to apply for temporary protected status. Next up, we have lawful permanent residents, more commonly known as green card holders. Green card holders are permitted to live in work in the US indefinitely. The only exception to that is if you commit a felony, generally speaking, you can be placed in proceedings and deported or removed, depending on the crime. You can leave and enter the United States. You don't need a visa. You can travel with your green card. The green card is also the first step to citizenship, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. Green card holders can also sponsor their spouses and unmarried children for permanent residence in the United States. And as I mentioned previously, can be deported or denied admission in certain circumstances. An example of being denied admission would be if somebody traveled abroad and stayed for more than 6 months abroad without getting permission in your permanent resident status here in the United States. And you could be asked to give it up if you try to return to the United States. So there are some restrictions, but generally speaking, your green card can be renewed indefinitely. To become a lawful permanent resident, you have to have a qualifying relationship or circumstance. So that means either you're sponsored by a family member, you're sponsored by an employer, you qualify based on your refugee or asylee status. The United States also has a diversity visa lottery, which is just as it sounds. Applications become available to certain countries who don't often immigrate to the United States, and you can apply and see if you get selected in the lottery qualifications, and then you're eligible for a green card if you meet all of those qualifications. There's also something called a special immigrant juvenile, or SIJ. SIJ is the short term for that. Those are exactly as it sounds like, juveniles who are either here by themselves, cross the border by themselves, maybe don't have a sponsor here, but have a reason to stay. That's another way to adjust to a lawful permanent resident. It's a humanitarian option. After you've determined you have a qualifying relationship or circumstance, meaning a family member sponsored you and it was approved, the next step is to actually apply for your green card. And there's two ways to do that. If you're in the United States, you apply for what's called an adjustment of status. If you're outside of the United States, you have to go through what's called consular processing. Both of those steps require interview by government officials, medical exams to show you have no transmittable or communicable diseases, and you must meet all the requirements in order to come in. So it's quite a process. It takes some time. I listed some family-based categories here. This is probably the most common way that people file for their green cards. I think it's been in the news a little bit. The current administration likes to call it chain migration, people sponsoring their family members after they either become a green card holder or a US. Different preference categories here. Immediate relatives those visas are always available, meaning you can apply for your spouse at any time. And then the preferences have longer and longer wait times as you go down. So the fourth preference, brothers and sisters of adult US citizens, they have the longest wait time. Right now it can be up to 15 years. So it's not an immediate process at all. Okay, this leads us to citizenship, which is what tonight is about. So citizenship, our US citizenship, is birthright citizenship, meaning you are born here in the United States or a US territory, or you're born outside the US to US citizen parents or parent. Naturalization, which means you were born outside the US, you immigrate to the United States and obtain a green card, and then you naturalize. Or derivative citizenship. Children of naturalized immigrants may derive that citizenship from their parents, depending on who they live with, where they are, and their age. So those are the three immigrants can acquire citizenship in the United States. To become a US citizen, you must first be a lawful permanent resident or green card holder. I use those terms interchangeably. And you have to meet the requisite time periods. So generally speaking, you have to have been a green card holder for 5 years. The exceptions to that are if you received your green card based on marriage to a US citizen, you get a little break and you can apply in 3 years. So it's a shorter time period. You have to use it though at the time you apply for your naturalization. Military service is another way to do your naturalization quicker. If you have your green card and you're active duty military for at least a year, generally you can also apply to naturalize that way. Those are the very general requirements. After you have determined you meet those requirements, the next step is to actually apply for naturalization. That application is via a form N400, which is a 20-something page form. It is submitted to an immigration service, which is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. Once that application is submitted, you will receive a receipt notice, followed by what's called a biometrics notice, where you will be given an appointment to have your fingerprints done, your photo taken, and then eventually you'll be called for an interview with USCIS. If everything goes well at the interview, you pass the English test, the civics test, you can then be sworn in and take the oath of citizenship, and that's the final step to actually becoming a citizen. So let's talk about naturalization a little bit more in depth and who is eligible. The principal applicant has to be over 18. You can apply for naturalization as a minor. You must have resided continuously in the US for the requisite period, which as we previously discussed is usually either 5 or 3 years. During that 5 or 3 year period, you have to have been physically present for at least half of that period. So either 30 months if you're applying based on 5 years, 18 months if you're applying based on the 3 years. Another important point, when you apply for citizenship, you have to have been living in the, let me see how to word this, living in the area you're applying in for at least 3 months. So for example, if I wanted to apply for citizenship, but I just moved to New Hampshire last week, I would have to wait for 3 months before I could actually submit that application. In addition to the residence and physical presence requirements, you have to be a person of good moral character. There are all sorts of legal things written on what good moral character is. Generally speaking, if you have crimes in your past, depending on what those crimes are, depending on how long ago they were, you may or may not be eligible to apply. It really depends. That's really determined on a case-by-case basis. In addition to having good moral character, you also have to have an understanding of the English language. The English test is pretty straightforward. You have to read a sentence in English and write a sentence in English, and the interview is conducted in English. That for people who are a little bit older and have also resided here for a number of years. But generally speaking, English language is a requirement for citizenship. At the interview, you also have to take a US history and civics test. And you have to pass that as well before you can be issued the oath of allegiance to the United States. So let's talk about the civics test a little bit. I know people are often interested in this. The gist of it is that USCIS interviews have 100 questions that they can choose from, and they can ask applicants up to 10 of those 100 questions. Applicants only have to get 6 correct. So you only have to get a 60%. I always tell my clients, it's just 6. You only have to get 6 right. But I will be honest, most people are so excited and grateful to be applying that they know everything backwards, forwards, up and down before they go into that interview. The categories of the civics questions include American government, American history, integrated civics, and holidays. Some of the questions can change depending on elected officials, also Supreme Court justices, that's very timely. But those are all questions that can be there. Something else that was very timely, I know during the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, some people were giving her a hard time for not knowing the 5 freedoms from the First Amendment. That is actually on the naturalization test. So immigration attorneys all over the country were like, oh my goodness, how can she not know this? But our clients have to know this, and her isn't really totally wrong. But it's just interesting how these things pop up in everyday life, and they're very relevant. I also included a link to the civics test study guide, which includes all 100 of those questions if people want to take a look on their own time. I think especially for students in elementary and middle school, most of them will probably be shocked by how much of this they actually already know. And it's kind of a fun thing to do, I think, with students. We do it when we present to younger children sometimes as well. Okay, so that leads us to the benefit of citizenship in the United States. Arguably, I think the biggest benefit is voting rights, which is also why we're here tonight, can vote in federal elections like the current presidential election. That is huge for immigrant communities, especially people who have been living here for 5 years, for 3 years, for 20 years, who are affected by the laws that are made in Congress. This is huge for them, especially when we have an administration like the current administration who has been changing a lot of things with immigration, because it directly impacts their lives, their families, their ability to sponsor their families. So voting, I think, that I've heard from my clients. Next up is bringing family members to the US. Once you're a US citizen, your spouse, your parents, your children are considered immediate relatives, and you can bring them immediately, which is also huge, especially for families that have been separated for some reason. Eligibility for federal jobs. Most jobs with the government agencies here in the US require citizenship. So it opens up a whole nother realm. Also becoming an elected official. Many elected offices in the US require citizenship. It also gives immigrants a layer of protection. They can't be deported once they have citizenship. A really basic and unfortunately common example of this is a DUI. People make mistakes, but if you get a DUI while you have a green card, you can possibly be deported and lose everything. Whereas if you're a citizen and you make a mistake and you get a DUI, you're not going to be deported. So it is an added layer. And you can only lose your citizenship under extremely limited circumstances. I think the most common, and I'm smiling because it's really not that common, is fraud. If there's a finding of fraud somewhere in your history, or you obtain citizenship based on fraud, obviously in that situation, it can be taken away. Responsibilities of citizenship. When you take the oath of allegiance to the United States, you're basically saying that you will support and defend the Constitution, that you'll stand informed, participate in the democratic process, so voting, respect and obey federal, state, and local laws, respect the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others, participate in your local community. I think that's on there twice, sorry about that. Pay income and taxes, which lawful permanent residents also have to pay taxes. You can serve on a jury if you're called, and defend the country should the need arise if there was ever a draft. Those are the responsibilities of citizenship here in the United States. And then I just put our contact information up if people have follow-up. That is the end of my presentation about basically the immigrant experience and what it takes to obtain citizenship here in the United States. And I think at this point, I guess I'll turn it to Kristen in case there's any questions.
All right. Yeah, if you want to unshare your screen so we can get everybody. Awesome. I will be sending out the presentation along with the recording, so everybody will be able to get Chiara's slides. So I'd like to, at this time, invite any questions in the chat for Chiara about anything she presented about, or questions about immigration, things she didn't cover that you might have. Any thoughts on how to teach this to middle school kids?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't get the chat to work, but I'm wondering if you could give us a little background into who the Dreamers are and what that is.
Sure. Dreamer, deferred action for childhood arrivals. This is something that has also been in the news. It is also considered a humanitarian status, a temporary status, similar to TPS. And deferred action for childhood arrivals is exactly what it sounds like. It is the government not granting a status per se, but saying, we recognize you, we're going to give you an employment authorization to allow you to work, and we are going to defer any action, meaning we're not going to put you in removal proceeding. That is what the DACA program does. It does not right now give a grant to permanent residency. It does not have a pathway to citizenship. It is truly limbo right now. the current administration tried to end the program, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, who said no. But they didn't say no because you can't end it. They said, no, you can't end it this way because procedurally you didn't do it correctly, and basically laid out the framework for them to end it should they want to. So it truly is up in the air right now, but that is the gist of children that were brought here by their parents who didn't have a choice. You know, they were too young to make a decision, and have generally grown up here and feel like they are Americans, because they don't know any otherwise. You know, they probably have never been to their country of birth. Some don't even speak the language. And all of the DACA recipients I have met have been extremely passionate about their desire to stay in the United States. I think another thing about DACA is that you have to have issues to be afforded that recognition and the ability to work. So it is something that's kind of up in the air right now. We'll see what happens, I guess, next week, in the coming months, because I think that will factor into what happens to the program.
Thank you.
And I'd actually like to capitalize on that because of something that you said. So immigration policy is set in several different ways, right? There's executive order, there's sort of court decisions, and then there's sort of the congressional, you know, I mean, maybe I'm missing a few, I'm sure. Can you talk about a little bit the difference between them? I presume they're all effective the same way.
Sure. So our immigration system is extremely complex. There's no getting around it. Generally speaking, it's based on the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which does give the executive office, the president, full authority over it, which is why the president can issue executive orders and can issue presidential proclamation and directly impact immigrants and the immigrant community. Some of the ones I think that people are most familiar with include the Muslim ban initially. Right now, there's actually travel bans in place for immigrants, for temporary non-immigrant workers. There's quite a bit that has come into play because of COVID. But the way that the laws are set is it goes through the rulemaking process. There is supposed to be a public comment period once it gets posted on the Federal Registrar. You know, there are ways to navigate that, but generally speaking, it's all based on the INA that has then been codified at 8 CFR, and there's regs galore. There's also policy memos that come out of the different governmental agencies based on their leaders and what they're seeing that don't necessarily, they're not considered laws, but it can be considered binding policy because it's how they interpret the laws. But the reason immigration is so fluid and can change so often is because the executive office does have control over it. Policy, executive orders, proclamations can all come out at any point. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, trying to get the mute button. Well, and that actually brings up another point of this like ever-changing nature of immigration law. And I'm sure it happened in many previous administrations, you know, as I think we're very immediate centric in our lives today, right? Not everybody's a historian. But thinking about this, it feels like there's a new immigration law every day or immigration policy. How does that affect your job? How does that affect what, you know, your clients?
Sure. So I guess I would put it this way. I've heard a lot of people refer to the ongoing pandemic as the Corona coaster, where there's ups and downs and it changes constantly. That is how immigration law has been, you know, I would say more so for the past almost 4 years. There's actually, it's fascinating. But you can see the current administration has made more changes than any prior administration. In fact, I think the number of executive orders and proclamations that have come out and rule changes, it's almost 500. It is a massive number. And it's really crazy when you try to wrap your head around it. So I think immigration attorneys all over the country have had to be really flexible, really upfront with clients. I tell clients that things could change. A good example of this was there was supposed to be a massive fee increase for the filing fees at USCIS on October 2nd. And in the 9th hour, there was a lawsuit filed, but in the 9th hour, a federal judge ruled and granted an injunction to stop that fee increase. So we had been rushing runways out the door prior to that increase. And then there was an injunction, which is amazing, but it's all temporary. We don't know how long that's going to be in play. We don't know what's going to happen. And that is how I would describe immigration for the past several years, is that you have to be very flexible. I think it's really tested our ability to communicate with clients in a way that doesn't terrify them, but also gives them a realistic perspective of what could happen. And it's been challenging, definitely. It's impacted every aspect of immigration, though. It's, you know, asylum has been drastically changed. There's a lot of it's been in the news, the catch and release policy, the waiting in Mexico, obviously the awful separation of families at the border. Those are some of the, you know, standout ones, but on a much smaller, more granular scale, employment-based visas have been hugely impacted by the current administration. There's all sorts of pending lawsuits on that. So it's also US businesses that are impacted ultimately. Student visas this summer, they issued a rule immediately, especially here in New England. I was very proud to be part of, you know, the New England group, and all of the wonderful universities and colleges we have here, you know, immediately filed suit and were successful in getting an injunction. So it's been a very fluid situation.
Other questions from the group? I have many more that I can ask. I know your interactions with your clients are confidential, but you did share something with Ellen and I at the very beginning before folks came on about your clients who were first-time voters. And I didn't know if you had if you would like to share that story or other, because I feel like as a natural-born US citizen, I and the people in my circle often take for granted what it means to be a US citizen. So I love hearing from my friends who are immigrants and who are citizens, or other stories of folks who, I think it grounds us as natural-born citizens by hearing stories of other people.
Sure, I'm happy to share, because honestly, it's the best part of my job, is when, you know, you've been with somebody, you know, especially the clients that we've been with from the beginning, who maybe entered as a refugee, you know, based on what our organization does. Then we're able to apply for their green cards and obtain their green cards, and then eventually citizenship. It's really closing that loop, right? It's full assimilation to the United States, and becoming a US citizen is and most clients, honestly, all clients that I've worked with are so proud at that point, because the US has become their home, and to be able to participate and do their civic duty is huge. It's massive. So the story that Kristen mentions is that most recently, just a few weeks ago, we had a client who was sworn in and received her certificate of citizenship, and she immediately registered to vote. And I think it was extra special for her because she had been here basically, and she had a adult son who had just turned 19, and he was US born, so a citizen by birthright, but it was his first election, first time being able to vote. And they voted together, and they were so excited to do that and share that experience. And I think that is something that, I don't want to say we take it for granted, but we don't have the same perspective. This is somebody who had been living here, you know, for 20 plus years, and it was the first time that her voice was counted, even though she was still of the land. This is the first time she actually had a say in that. So that's huge.
The other thing that often strikes me is when I hear about immigration policies in other countries. Like, so many other countries don't want people to become citizens. They don't want people to move in and be a part, and that America is this sort of country of immigrants that has always been sort of refreshing, and who gets to qualify. I don't know how much you know about the international naturalization policy, but can you give us a compare contrast between the US and another country?
So let me preface this by saying I know very, very little, speaking, but there are some countries that the process is fairly straightforward and simple. There are some where it's much, much harder. I think it depends on the country. But to your first point, the US is very much a nation founded by immigrants. I mean, that's how we started. And I think our, innovation and our success, and a lot of that is from the talent and skills of immigrants. Plus the diversity and all that brings to the table from different perspectives and different skill sets and different knowledge bases. But that being said, as far as a compare and contrast, I would say it's country by country. There are some that are somewhat similar to the US, where you have a permanent status and you have to be there before you can become a citizen of that nation. There are some where it's much harder, or even not even an option, period. But it really just depends.
Thank you. I'm going to segue real quick to share with you some of the documents set that we put together, and then we can return to Chiara if there are any last questions. So I am going to share my screen so that you can see. You can all see my website page, or webpage. Thank you. So on the page from our website for this presentation, there are 2 links at the bottom right here. This one will take you to our Google site, which is a set of documents that we've put together, mostly excerpts of documents, not full documents, because that's a lot. As Chiara mentioned, is boxes and boxes and pages and pages. So for example, for how citizenship laws have changed throughout US history, looking at the Nationality Act of 1790, and then going forward through time and seeing how it has changed over time, and who gets to qualify as a citizen and not, is very fascinating for students to look at. We've also included a couple of court cases. This one is Elk v. Wilkins, and it deals with Native people, indigenous people, and whether or not they qualified for birthright citizenship. And so there was a Supreme Court case in 1884 about that. And then we also accompanied that with an excerpt from the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. And I think it's really interesting for students to examine the plight of indigenous people in the United States, who technically are Native Americans. They're native born, but they haven't always been considered citizens of this country. And I think it's a real interesting puzzle for kids to think through. So we've referenced the Chinese Exclusion Act here with this comic. So it's not just documents, we're also looking at other images and primary sources, and accompanying that with another Supreme Court case, US v. Wong Kim Ark, which was a really interesting case about an American-born man of Chinese descent who went to China and then was denied reentry into the United States. So that idea again of who gets to be a citizen, natural-born citizens, and who is a citizen. And then finally, we included a map here, the little bit of information about what this map called, the Pew Research Center calls unauthorized immigrants by state. So this is in 2016. So looking at the population, so we're asking students to analyze this as a graph. And then pertinent to a question earlier, we've accompanied that with a news article about the DREAM Act, Dreamers, and we can't avoid including a tweet here. So a rally that was held in Boston about a rally a tweet about a rally that was in Boston. So these are some of the documents that we've included. Also on this page is a link here to a Google form. And for teachers, you'll be, if you click on that, you'll be asked to make a copy, a forced copy, so that you can put that in your Google Classroom or other learning management system and collect those answers directly. And so we have put a series of writing prompts here to get kids engaged with the documents, to really think about, compare and contrast the documents, asking their personal opinions about, for example, the DREAM Act, what impact would it have? And then finally, we ask them to engage in some prediction about how citizenship laws might evolve in the future, with citing evidence from the past to support their claims. So it's sort of a document analysis, writing analysis prompts that we've included here. I'm going to stop share. And then I will invite any final questions, thoughts, comments. Chiara, is there any sort of coda or epilogue you'd like to add to the presentation this evening?
I'm so sorry, you cut out at the end. I didn't quite catch the end of that.
Oh, I just asked if you wanted to add a coda to the evening's presentation.
I think, I appreciate everybody attending. I think, for me, for what I do, I think it's important to understand the process of citizenship and what immigrants have to go through to get there. It's not an easy process. And I think that's why it's so important also, and why they break their vote at the end of it. So that's it. Everybody vote if you haven't already. That's my final pitch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I can't believe how many times in the last month I have asked people what their voting plan is, because I've never asked that question before. Thank you to everybody. I will be emailing out the presentation and the recording for folks who would like to see it, forward it to friends. We're off next week because it's a big night, and I'm sure folks will be glued to CNN or whatever your preferred news outlet is. And we'll pick up again on November 10th. We'll be specifically looking at the lawsuit brought by Lowell's immigrant communities and their push for equitable voting representation in the city. Professor Sue Kim from UMass Lowell, who was a plaintiff in the lawsuit, and Oren Selstrom, who was an attorney for the plaintiffs, will be speaking about the case out the city of Lowell. So that is all I have. So if anybody else has anything to share, certainly welcome to. If not, thank you. Good night and vote.